My name is Mahalia, and this is the hardest story I will ever tell. This is about what they did to my body, to my children, and to my soul during the 23 years I spent as human breeding stock on the Whitmore plantation in Louisiana. This is about how they turned motherhood into slavery's cruelest weapon, and how I fought to save my children from inheriting the chains that bound me. I was born free in 1825 in a small community of liberated slaves near New Orleans, the daughter of parents who had purchased their own freedom through years of careful saving and sacrifice. My father, Isaac, worked as a skilled carpenter, and my mother, Grace, took in washing and mending for wealthy families in the city. They had built a small but comfortable life for themselves, and they raised me with the understanding that freedom was precious precisely because it could be lost. Our community was called Treme, and it was a testament to what enslaved people could accomplish when given the chance to control their own lives. We had our own church, Mount Olive Baptist, where Reverend Samuel preached about dignity and self-determination. We had our own school where children like me learned to read and write from teachers who understood that education was the foundation of true freedom. We had our own businesses that served both the free black population and sympathetic white customers who valued quality work over racial prejudice. The houses in our neighborhood were modest but well maintained, painted in bright colors that proclaimed our pride in our community and our determination to create beauty in a world that often denied our humanity. My family's home had 2 rooms, a luxury compared to slave quarters, with glass windows that let in sunlight and wooden floors that my mother kept polished to a shine. Children like me grew up understanding that we were different from the enslaved people who worked in the big houses and plantations around New Orleans. We attended school every day, learned to speak French as well as English, and were taught that our minds belonged to us in ways that our bodies might not always be guaranteed to remain ours. My parents spoke often about the fragility of our freedom, the constant vigilance required to maintain it, and the importance of being prepared for any circumstance that might threaten our liberty. But freedom for people like us was always precarious, always subject to the whims of white society and the economic pressures that made human bondage profitable. The laws of Louisiana were particularly harsh toward free blacks, requiring us to carry papers proving our status at all times, restricting our movement after dark, and limiting our right to assemble or conduct business without white supervision. When I was 16 years old, our world collapsed in a single afternoon that taught me how quickly liberty could be transformed into slavery through the machinery of law and power. It was a Tuesday in March 1841, a day that had started like any other with my father leaving for work on a construction project in the French Quarter and my mother preparing for a day of washing clothes for her regular customers. My father had been accused of stealing tools from a job site where he had been working as part of a crew building, an addition to a wealthy merchant's home. The accusation came from the white contractor who employed him, a man named Philippe Rousseau, who claimed that expensive carpenter's tools had gone missing from the worksite and that my father was the only person with both access to the storage area and the skill to know which tools were most valuable. The charge was both false and impossible to disprove, since my father's word as a free black man carried little weight against the testimony of a white businessman with connections throughout the city's commercial community. Despite my father's protestations of innocence, despite the testimony of other workers who vouched for his character and honesty, despite the fact that none of the allegedly stolen tools had been found in our possession, the local magistrate ruled that Isaac owed compensation for the theft. The monetary judgment was set at an impossible sum, $300, more than my father could earn in 2 years of steady work. When my parents couldn't pay the inflated amount demanded as restitution, the court ordered that the family's assets be seized and that my father be sold into slavery to satisfy the debt. But the judgment extended beyond my father alone, encompassing our entire household as part of his financial obligations under Louisiana's harsh debt laws. In a single morning, my mother, my younger brother Samuel, and I went from free citizens to human property, our papers of manumission declared void by the court's ruling. We were loaded onto a wagon with our few remaining possessions and transported to the Whitmore plantation to begin lives we had never imagined we would have to live. The journey from New Orleans to the plantation took 2 days, traveling through landscapes that became increasingly isolated and threatening as we moved away from the protections of city life and deeper into the rural areas where plantation owners wielded absolute authority over their domains. We passed endless fields of sugarcane, magnificent mansions surrounded by elegant gardens, and clusters of slave quarters that housed the workers whose labor made such wealth possible. Master Robert Whitmore owned one of the largest sugar plantations in Louisiana, a sprawling operation called Belle Grove that encompassed nearly 6,000 acres of some of the richest agricultural land in the South. The plantation was located along the Mississippi River, where fertile soil and easy transportation access made sugar cultivation enormously profitable for those who could afford the initial investment in land, equipment, and human labor. Unlike cotton plantations that relied primarily on field labor during specific seasons, sugar operations required year-round work and a complex infrastructure of skilled workers, seasonal laborers, and specialized facilities that made the workforce more valuable and therefore more carefully managed. There were carpenters who built and maintained the elaborate machinery required for sugar processing, blacksmiths who forged tools and repaired equipment, coopers who made the barrels used for shipping, mechanics who maintained the steam engines that powered the mills, and dozens of other specialists whose skills made the operation profitable and efficient. But Master Whitmore had also developed what he considered a more scientific approach to managing his human property, one that involved careful attention to breeding, genetics, and the production of future generations of workers. He kept detailed records of bloodlines, physical characteristics, and reproductive histories, treating his enslaved people like livestock to be improved through selective mating. This approach had been influenced by his correspondence with other plantation owners throughout the South, who shared his interest in what they called scientific slavery, the application of agricultural breeding techniques to human beings in order to produce stronger, more intelligent, and more compliant workers. They exchanged information about which combinations of parents produced the most valuable offspring, which bloodlines showed the greatest resistance to disease, and which traits could be enhanced through careful selection and controlled reproduction. Master Whitmore subscribed to agricultural journals that discussed breeding techniques for livestock, and he adapted these methods to his management of enslaved people with the same systematic approach that he applied to improving his sugarcane crops. He maintained stud books that recorded the ancestry and characteristics of his human property, planned mating based on genetic considerations, and tracked the development of children with the attention of a scientist conducting long-term experiments. When we arrived at the plantation, we were subjected to the same kind of inspection that might be applied to newly purchased cattle or horses. A doctor named Henderson, who served as both physician and veterinarian for the plantation, examined our teeth to estimate our ages, tested our strength by having us lift heavy objects, checked our eyes and ears for signs of defects, and evaluated our potential for various kinds of work based on our physical characteristics and apparent intelligence. My mother, at 42, was assigned to kitchen duties where her experience with cooking and cleaning would be useful, but where her age would not interfere with her productivity. My brother Samuel, barely 14 but tall for his age, was sent to work with the field hands where he would learn the basic skills of agricultural labor, while his body developed the strength necessary for heavy work. But my examination was different, more invasive, more focused on aspects of my body that had nothing to do with my ability to work in any conventional sense. Dr. Henderson noted my height, my build, the clarity of my skin, the fullness of my hips, and what he described in his notes as excellent breeding potential. At 16, I was considered ideal for what Master Whitmore called his improvement program. This one will do very well indeed, Dr. Henderson told Master Whitmore, as I stood naked and humiliated in his study, my body discussed as if I were a prize heifer being evaluated for purchase. Good wide hips for easy childbearing, healthy constitution with no obvious defects, intelligent features that suggest quality offspring. The bone structure indicates she'll mature into a strong woman capable of producing multiple children. I recommend immediate inclusion in the breeding program. Master Whitmore made notes in a leather-bound ledger, recording my physical characteristics, alongside an assessment of my potential value as a breeder. What about bloodline? He asked. Any information about her parents' backgrounds? Father was a skilled carpenter, mother apparently an experienced house servant before their manumission, Dr. Henderson replied. Both show signs of intelligence and good health. The breeding should produce valuable offspring, especially if we pair her with one of our premium males. I didn't understand what they meant until later that evening, when an older woman named Celia explained the reality of my situation with the blunt honesty of someone who had endured the same fate for 15 years and had watched dozens of other young women learn the same terrible truth. "You've been selected for breeding, child," she told me as we sat in the cabin that would be my new home, a structure slightly larger and better furnished than the standard slave quarters, but still designed to accommodate the specific requirements of the plantation's reproduction program. "Means they're going to choose men for you to mate with, trying to produce babies they can sell or keep for workers. Your body don't belong to you no more, if it ever did. Belongs to the master, and he going to use it however he thinks will make him the most money." Celia had been purchased specifically for breeding when she was 15 years old, and she had given birth to 11 children during her years in the program. Some had been sold to other plantations, others had been kept to work at Belle Grove, and several had died in infancy from the diseases and neglect that claimed so many enslaved children. She spoke about her experiences with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to survive by accepting realities that could not be changed. "The key to surviving this," she continued, "is understanding that they're going to take everything from you they can, but they can't take your mind unless you let them. You got to find ways to keep some part of yourself separate from what they do to your body, some place inside where you still belong to you." The breeding program operated with the same systematic approach that Master Whitmore applied to his agricultural operations. Detailed records were kept of every pregnancy, every birth, every child's development, and eventual fate. Women were paired with men chosen for their physical characteristics, their intelligence, their skills, or their potential to produce valuable offspring based on the master's understanding of genetic inheritance. Master Whitmore consulted with doctors from New Orleans, read agricultural journals that discussed breeding techniques, and corresponded with other plantation owners throughout the South to develop what he considered the most advanced breeding methods available. He tracked bloodlines like a horse breeder, noting which combinations produced the strongest children, which mothers had the easiest births, which fathers contributed the most desirable traits to their offspring. The breeding quarters were located in a separate section of the plantation, away from the regular slave quarters, in cabins that were slightly larger and better furnished to ensure the health and comfort of the women and children involved in the program. Each cabin housed a breeding pair, along with any young children who had not yet been assigned to other quarters or sold to different plantations. My first assignment came within a month of my arrival, when I was informed that I would be paired with a man named Abraham, a skilled blacksmith whose strength, intelligence, and proven fertility made him a valuable contributor to the master's genetic experiments. Abraham was 28 years old, powerfully built from years of working with heavy metal and fire, and possessed of a quiet dignity that had somehow survived his 15 years of enslavement. Abraham was a good man, gentle and kind despite the circumstances that had brought us together, but the situation was inherently degrading for both of us. We were forced to live as husband and wife without having chosen each other, to create children under circumstances that denied us any control over their futures, to build some semblance of intimacy while knowing that our relationship existed solely for the master's economic benefit. We were housed together in a cabin designed specifically for breeding couples, given slightly better food and clothing to ensure our health during the reproductive process, and monitored constantly by overseers and trusted house servants to ensure that we were fulfilling our biological obligations. Privacy was non-existent, dignity was irrelevant, and love was considered a luxury that might interfere with the efficient production of valuable children. Dr. Henderson tracked my menstrual cycle with the same attention he gave to the breeding schedules of the plantation's livestock, recording dates and symptoms that would help predict optimal times for conception. When I failed to become pregnant within the first 3 months, he prescribed changes to my diet and work assignments designed to improve my fertility, treating my body like a machine that needed adjustment to function properly. The first pregnancy came in my 4th month with Abraham, and I experienced the complex emotions of a woman whose body was creating new life under circumstances that denied her any joy in the process. I loved the child growing inside me, but I also understood that my love would make both of us vulnerable to the master's control and manipulation. Dr. Henderson monitored my pregnancy with careful attention, adjusting my diet to ensure proper nutrition, reducing my work assignments to prevent physical stress that might interfere with fetal development, and preparing detailed plans for the delivery that would maximize the chances of producing a healthy, valuable child. I gave birth to a daughter I named Hope, though I knew that even her name was subject to the master's approval, and that she might be renamed if she were eventually sold to another plantation. She was a beautiful child, healthy and alert, with features that combined the best characteristics of her parents and skin light enough to make her valuable in the slave markets that prized mixed-race children for housework and specialized tasks. Master Whitmore was pleased with the result and made detailed notes about her development for future reference, tracking her growth, her health, her apparent intelligence, and her potential value as either a worker or a future breeder. Even as I held my newborn daughter, I understood that she belonged to Master Whitmore more than she belonged to me, that he would decide her fate, her future, her value, and her eventual disposition. But the birth of Hope also awakened something in me that I had not expected, a fierce protective instinct that would drive me to take risks I had never imagined myself capable of taking. She might be the master's property according to law and custom, but she was my child according to nature and love, and I was determined to find ways to protect her from the fate that had been planned for her before she was even born. The systematic dehumanization of the breeding program extended far beyond the physical act of reproduction. Every aspect of our lives was controlled and monitored to ensure optimal reproductive outcomes. Our diet was managed by Dr. Henderson to promote fertility and healthy pregnancies, with special rations of meat, milk, and vegetables that were denied to field hands and other workers. Our work assignments were carefully adjusted to minimize physical stress that might interfere with conception or birth, but also to ensure that we remained productive contributors to the plantation's economy. Breeding women were typically assigned to lighter tasks like cooking, cleaning, childcare, or textile work that could be performed without endangering pregnancies or exhausting bodies needed for reproduction. Our social interactions were limited and carefully monitored to prevent emotional attachments that might interfere with breeding assignments or encourage resistance to the program. I was not allowed to form close friendships with other women, since emotional support might give me the strength to resist the master's demands. I was not permitted to spend excessive time with my children once they reached a certain age, since maternal bonding might interfere with my willingness to have them taken away when the master deemed it appropriate for their training or sale. Even my relationship with Abraham was carefully managed to ensure that our primary focus remained on reproduction rather than companionship or emotional intimacy. We were encouraged to cooperate in the production of children, but discouraged from developing the kind of deep emotional bond that might lead us to prioritize our family's welfare over the master's economic interests. Over the course of 8 years, I gave birth to 6 children with Abraham, each one the result of careful planning and genetic calculation rather than love or choice. 3 daughters, named Hope, Faith, and Grace, and 3 sons named David, Solomon, and Isaac after my father. All were healthy, all were intelligent, all bore the physical characteristics that Master Whitmore valued in his breeding stock. Each birth was both a joy and a tragedy, bringing new life into the world while simultaneously expanding the population of human beings who would spend their lives in bondage. I loved my children completely, but I also knew that my love made them vulnerable, that my attachment to them gave the master additional power over my behavior and compliance. The children lived with Abraham and me in our cabin until they reached the age of 8, when they were moved to separate quarters to begin their training for adult roles on the plantation. The boys were assigned to learn agricultural skills or crafts that would make them valuable workers, while the girls were prepared for either field work or domestic service, depending on their individual characteristics and the master's assessment of their potential. When Hope turned 8 years old, Master Whitmore decided that she was ready to begin training for her eventual role in the breeding program. She was moved to a separate cabin where she would be educated in the domestic skills that would make her valuable as both a worker and a future mother, but also where she would begin the psychological conditioning that would prepare her to accept her fate as breeding stock. The separation from my eldest daughter was devastating, marking the beginning of the systematic dismantling of our family structure that was an integral part of the breeding program's design. I was no longer allowed to see Hope except during supervised visits that were carefully limited to prevent the formation of emotional bonds that might interfere with her training or my continued reproductive obligations. The loss of daily contact with my daughter was both heartbreaking and educational, teaching me that the breeding program was designed not just to produce children, but to break the bonds between mothers and their offspring, to prevent the formation of family structures that might provide emotional support or encourage resistance to the plantation's authority. Within months of Hope's removal, I was paired with a new partner, a man named Joshua who had been selected for his size, strength, and the success of his previous breeding assignments with other women in the program. Abraham was simultaneously assigned to a different woman, a young field hand whose physical characteristics complemented his genetic profile according to Master Whitmore's breeding theories. The casual dissolution of our 8-year relationship, the separation from our children, and the immediate assignment to new reproductive obligations demonstrated the complete subordination of human emotion and family bonds to the economic requirements of the plantation system. We were breeding animals whose personal feelings were irrelevant to our function as producers of valuable offspring. But the separation from Hope also marked the beginning of my active resistance to the program that had controlled my life for nearly a decade. Watching my daughter being prepared for the same fate that had befallen me awakened a rage that overcame my fear of consequences, driving me to begin planning ways to protect my remaining children from the systematic dehumanization that defined their futures. The opportunities for resistance were limited, but not non-existent. Through careful observation and conversation with other women in the program, I learned which plants could prevent pregnancy when consumed in carefully measured doses. Information passed down through generations of enslaved women who had found ways to exercise some control over their reproductive lives, despite the constant monitoring of their bodies and behavior. I discovered that cotton root bark, when prepared as a tea and consumed during specific times in the menstrual cycle, could prevent conception without causing obvious symptoms that might alert Dr. Henderson to deliberate interference with the breeding program. Wild carrot seeds, pennyroyal, and certain combinations of common herbs could achieve similar results when used with knowledge and caution. More dangerously, I learned which combinations of foods and herbs could induce miscarriages when pregnancy was unwanted, though the risks to my own health were substantial and the consequences of discovery would likely include death. These methods required careful timing, precise dosages, and complete secrecy, since any pattern of reproductive failure would eventually attract attention from the master and his medical advisors. More importantly, I began to build networks of communication and support among the other women in the breeding program, sharing information about the master's plans, the movements of children, and opportunities for sabotage that might disrupt the efficient operation of his genetic experiments without exposing individual participants to immediate retaliation. These networks had to be maintained in absolute secrecy, since discovery would result in severe punishment for everyone involved. We developed elaborate systems of coded communication using songs, hand gestures, and seemingly innocent conversations that allowed us to share information without arousing suspicion from overseers or informants among the enslaved population. Through these networks, I learned that Hope was being prepared for breeding earlier than originally planned, that Master Whitmore was eager to begin the next generation of his genetic experiments using the children he had already produced through his systematic approach to human reproduction. The news filled me with a rage that overcame my instinct for self-preservation, driving me to take actions I had never imagined I would be capable of. I began to plan Hope's escape from the plantation, a desperate scheme that would require careful timing, substantial resources, and the cooperation of people both inside and outside the enslaved community. The plan was dangerous and likely to fail, but the alternative was watching my daughter become another generation of breeding stock in the master's ongoing dehumanization program. The escape attempt was scheduled to coincide with the harvest season, when the plantation's routines were disrupted by the intensive labor required to process the sugarcane crop. Security was focused on preventing the theft of valuable sugar and protecting the expensive machinery used in processing, rather than monitoring the movements of individual enslaved people, providing a window of opportunity that might not come again for months. I had established contact with members of the Underground Railroad network operating in Louisiana, courageous individuals who risked their own lives to help enslaved people reach freedom in the North. Through carefully planned communications, I arranged for Hope to be hidden in a shipment of sugar barrels being transported to New Orleans, where sympathetic free blacks would help her reach the next station on her journey toward liberty. The plan required precise timing and the cooperation of several people who were risking their own lives to help a child they barely knew, motivated only by their commitment to the principle that no human being should be treated as breeding stock for another person's economic benefit. Her wagon driver, who was secretly sympathetic to the abolition cause, a dock worker in New Orleans who could provide temporary shelter, and several members of the free black community who could supply false papers and transportation to the next stage of the journey. But the escape was betrayed before it could be completed, apparently by one of the enslaved people on the plantation who had been coerced into serving as an informant for the master's security system. Hope was captured just outside the plantation boundaries, hidden in a sugar barrel that was searched by patrollers who had been alerted to watch for unusual cargo leaving the property. Master Whitmore's response was swift and cruel, designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance and to ensure that similar attempts would not be made in the future. Hope was beaten publicly in front of the entire enslaved population, then sold to a plantation in Texas, where the master specialized in training young women for the breeding programs of operations throughout the Southwest. The loss of my daughter was devastating, but it was also illuminating in ways that would shape my resistance activities for the rest of my time on the plantation. I understood that individual acts of heroism, no matter how courageous, were insufficient to challenge a system supported by law, custom, and enormous economic incentives. If I was going to protect my remaining children, I needed to find ways to undermine the breeding program itself rather than simply helping individuals escape from it. I began to use my knowledge of herbs and plants more systematically, not just to control my own fertility, but to help other women in the program avoid unwanted pregnancies or terminate pregnancies that would produce children destined for slavery. The work was dangerous and often resulted in serious health complications for the women involved, but it was also one of the few ways that enslaved women could exercise any control over their reproductive lives. I also began to share information about nutrition and childcare that would help other mothers protect their children's health, while subtly undermining the genetic goals of the breeding program. Techniques for reducing fertility in males through dietary adjustments, methods for causing minor health problems in children that would make them less valuable as breeding stock, and ways of encouraging behavioral problems that would make children unsuitable for specialized training programs. These activities were forms of sabotage, carefully disguised as accidents or ignorance, that would reduce the overall success rate of the master's experiments without creating obvious patterns that might lead to discovery. Small acts of resistance that, when multiplied across many participants, could significantly impact the profitability and efficiency of the breeding program. The Civil War began in 1861, bringing with it rumors of emancipation and the possibility of freedom for all enslaved people throughout the South. Master Whitmore initially dismissed these rumors as Northern propaganda designed to encourage rebellion and undermine the morale of enslaved workers. But as the conflict continued and Union forces moved closer to Louisiana, the reality of impending change became impossible to ignore. The breeding program continued, even as the war raged across the South, since Master Whitmore believed that the conflict would be brief and that the economic advantages of his scientific approach to slavery would become even more valuable in the post-war period, when labor shortages would make skilled workers more precious than ever. But the disruption of normal commerce, the threat of military action, and the departure of white men for military service made the plantation's operations increasingly difficult to maintain. Overseers were called away for military duty, leaving the complex breeding program under the supervision of fewer and less experienced personnel who were easier to deceive and manipulate. When Union forces finally reached our area in 1863, the plantation's social structure collapsed almost immediately. Master Whitmore fled with his family and as many portable assets as he could carry, leaving behind the elaborate infrastructure he had built and the human beings he had treated as experimental subjects for more than 2 decades. I was 38 years old when freedom came, the mother of children scattered across multiple states, the survivor of a breeding program that had treated my body as a machine for producing valuable property. The physical and emotional scars of those experiences would remain with me for the rest of my life, but I was finally free to make my own choices about my future and my relationships. In the chaos that followed emancipation, I began the long and often heartbreaking process of searching for my children, some of whom had been sold to plantations hundreds of miles away as part of Master Whitmore's business dealings over the years. The careful records that he had kept of bloodlines and breeding histories had been destroyed or scattered during his flight, making it nearly impossible to trace the locations of individual children or even to determine which ones had survived the harsh conditions of slavery. I eventually found 3 of my 6 children, now adults with families of their own, struggling to build new lives in a society that offered legal freedom but limited economic opportunities for former slaves. The reunions were joyful, but also heartbreaking, as we tried to rebuild relationships that had been deliberately destroyed by the breeding program and overcome the psychological damage caused by years of systematic dehumanization. This was the story of Mahalia Freeman, the name I chose for myself when emancipation made it possible to claim my own identity. For 23 years, I endured the systematic abuse of a breeding program that treated my body as property and my children as products. But I also found ways to resist, to protect others, and to preserve the humanity that slavery tried to destroy. The echoes of forced breeding programs resonate through generations, affecting families and communities in ways that extend far beyond the immediate victims. If these difficult but crucial stories of survival and resistance touch something deep within your soul, join our community. Subscribe to our channel for more untold truths from the shadows of history, narratives that explore the depths of human experience and the strength that people find in the darkest of times. Your support helps ensure these important stories continue to be told, honoring the memory of those who endured, so that we might understand the true cost of freedom and the resilience of the human spirit. My name is Josiah, and I need to tell you about the day I buried an axe in Silas Garrow's skull and felt justice flow through the dark waters of the dismal swamp. This is the story of how a man who made his living hunting human beings finally met his end at the hands of one who refused to be captured. I was born in 1822 on the Blackwater plantation in Virginia, 30 miles from the great dismal swamp that would eventually become my sanctuary and my battleground. Master Thomas Blackwater owned 200 souls, men and women who worked his tobacco fields and lived in quarters that were little better than animal pens. The plantation stretched along the Blackwater River, its fertile fields watered by the blood and sweat of people who would never own so much as the ground beneath their feet. The Blackwater plantation was considered one of the more profitable operations in eastern Virginia, spanning nearly 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land that had been in the Blackwater family for 4 generations. The big house sat on a hill overlooking the river, a massive Georgian mansion with white columns and sprawling verandas that served as both residence and symbol of the family's wealth and power. From the master's study windows, Thomas Blackwater could survey his entire domain, watching the endless rows of tobacco plants and the small figures of enslaved people who tended them from dawn to dusk. The slave quarters were located along the riverbank, 2 rows of wooden cabins that housed families in conditions that would have been considered inhumane if applied to livestock. Each cabin measured perhaps 12 feet by 16 feet, with a single room that served as living space, bedroom and kitchen for entire families regardless of size. The buildings were constructed from rough lumber with gaps between the boards that let in rain, wind and insects, providing minimal protection from the elements. My childhood was spent learning the bitter lessons that enslaved children must master: how to make yourself invisible when white folks were angry, how to endure hunger without complaint, how to watch your family suffer without being able to help. I learned to read by watching the master's children practice their letters, stealing moments of education when no one was looking, understanding that knowledge was both precious and dangerous for someone like me. The education came through careful observation and patient listening during the times when I was assigned to help around the big house. Master Blackwater's children, Thomas Jr. and Margaret, received tutoring from a governess who came from Richmond 3 times a week to teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, and the social graces expected of wealthy Southern children. I would position myself where I could watch their lessons while appearing to be busy with cleaning or other household tasks. Over the years, I gradually learned to recognize letters, then words, then entire sentences by watching the children practice their recitations and copying their exercises when they discarded practice papers. The process was slow and dangerous, since enslaved people caught reading could face severe punishment, but the knowledge I gained would prove invaluable in the years to come. My father, Moses, was the plantation blacksmith, a man whose skills made him valuable enough to receive slightly better treatment than the field hands. He worked in a large stone building near the big house, surrounded by the tools of his trade: anvils, hammers, tongs, and a forge that burned constantly during working hours. The blacksmith shop was both workplace and training ground, where I learned to work with metal and wood, to shape tools and repair machinery, to understand how things were built and how they could be broken. Moses taught me the secrets of working iron and steel, how to heat metal to the precise temperature needed for shaping, how to forge tools that would hold their edge, how to repair broken equipment so that it would be stronger than before. But he also taught me subtler lessons about resistance and survival, showing me how to create weapons that looked like tools, how to sabotage equipment without leaving obvious evidence, how to prepare for the day when violence might be the only path to freedom. My mother, Hannah, worked in the big house as a cook and seamstress, close enough to the master's family to understand their moods and habits, but also close enough to see the casual cruelty that marked their daily lives. She possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed her to anticipate trouble before it arrived, and she taught me to observe people carefully, to read expressions and gestures that might warn of danger. Hannah's position in the household gave our family access to information that field hands rarely obtained. She knew when visitors were expected, when business trips were planned, when financial pressures might lead to sales of enslaved people to raise cash. This knowledge allowed us to prepare for changes that might affect our lives, though our ability to influence events remained severely limited. The plantation was overseen by a man named Jacob Crawford, a thin, nervous individual whose cruelty seemed to increase with his own insecurity about his position. Crawford had been hired after the previous overseer was found dead in his cabin under circumstances that were never fully explained, and he was determined to prove his authority through the liberal use of violence and intimidation. Crawford carried himself like a man constantly expecting attack, his hand never far from the pistol he wore on his belt, his pale eyes scanning the faces of enslaved people for any sign of defiance or disrespect. He had been born poor white in the mountains of Western Virginia, and his position as overseer represented the highest social status he had ever achieved. The authority to command enslaved people was precious to him, precisely because it was the only power he had ever possessed. But Crawford was just one part of a larger system designed to keep enslaved people in bondage through a combination of legal restrictions, economic incentives, and the constant threat of pursuit and capture for those who attempted to escape. The system included not just plantation overseers and local law enforcement, but also professional slave catchers who made their living tracking down runaway property and returning it to its owners. Slave catchers operated throughout the South as specialized bounty hunters, equipped with tracking dogs, weapons, and the legal authority to pursue escaped enslaved people across state lines. They were paid substantial fees for successful captures, creating powerful economic incentives to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for hunting human beings. The most successful catchers could earn more in a year than many plantation owners, making slave catching one of the most lucrative professions available to men with the necessary skills and temperament. The profession attracted men who possessed a particular combination of tracking abilities, physical courage, and moral indifference to the suffering they caused. They needed to be skilled in wilderness survival, capable of following faint trails through difficult terrain, and comfortable with the violence that might be required to subdue desperate people fighting for their freedom. Among these professional hunters of human beings, none was more feared or more successful than Silas Garrow, a man who had made a fortune tracking down enslaved people throughout Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Garrow operated out of Norfolk, where he maintained kennels of specially trained bloodhounds, stored specialized equipment, and kept detailed records of successful captures that had earned him a reputation throughout the South. Garrow's success rate was legendary, approaching 90% over a career that spanned more than 15 years. He had never lost a trail that he had chosen to follow personally, never failed to return with the human property he had been hired to retrieve, and never shown mercy to anyone who tried to resist his efforts. His methods were brutal but effective, combining advanced tracking techniques with psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of his quarry. Garrow was a large man, well over 6 feet tall and powerfully built from years of tracking through difficult terrain. He wore his hair long and kept a full beard that made him look like some primitive hunter from an earlier age. He dressed in dark clothing that would blend with forest shadows, carried multiple weapons, and rode a horse trained to remain calm around the baying of hounds and the scent of fear. But what made Garrow truly dangerous was not his physical abilities or his equipment, but his understanding of human psychology and his willingness to use the most brutal methods to achieve his goals. He had studied the patterns of runaway slaves, learned to think like desperate people, and developed techniques for psychological manipulation that were often more effective than physical force. Garrow maintained detailed files on successful escapes, noting the methods used, the routes taken, and the mistakes that had led to eventual capture. He subscribed to newspapers throughout the South, tracking advertisements for runaway slaves and building a comprehensive database of escape patterns that allowed him to anticipate the decisions that fugitives might make. His reputation was enhanced by his willingness to pursue escapees into terrain that other catchers considered too dangerous or unprofitable. Garrow would follow trails into the Great Dismal Swamp, the Okefenokee, or the mountain wilderness of Appalachia, areas where most professional trackers feared to venture because of the natural hazards and the possibility of encountering armed resistance from communities of escaped slaves. My own encounter with the system that Garrow represented began in the summer of 1845, when I was 23 years old and had finally gathered the courage and resources necessary to attempt an escape from the Blackwater plantation. The decision to run was not made lightly, since I understood that failure would likely result in death. But remaining had become impossible after a series of events that convinced me that slavery would eventually destroy everything I cared about. The immediate trigger for my escape was Crawford's decision to sell my younger sister, Mary, to a trader who specialized in supplying enslaved people to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. Mary was only 16, but she had developed into a beautiful young woman whose presence on the plantation had begun to attract unwanted attention from both Crawford and Master Blackwater's eldest son, Thomas Jr. The situation had been building for months, with both men finding excuses to interact with Mary, commenting on her appearance, and making suggestions about how her skills might be better utilized. The tension between them was becoming obvious to everyone on the plantation, creating the kind of competition that could lead to violence or other serious consequences. Rather than deal with the complications that might arise from their competing interests in my sister, Master Blackwater had decided that the simplest solution was to sell her to a distant location where she would no longer be a source of potential conflict. The sale was presented as a business decision, a way to capitalize on Mary's market value while eliminating a potential problem, with no consideration given to the impact on our family or Mary's own wishes. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were notorious throughout the enslaved community as places of particular horror, where the combination of brutal labor, tropical diseases, and sadistic overseers created conditions that few people survived for more than a few years. Being sold to Louisiana was considered a death sentence, though one that might take years to complete. When I learned of the planned sale through my mother's connections in the big house, I begged Master Blackwater to reconsider, offering to work additional hours, to take on extra responsibilities, to do anything that might convince him to keep our family together. But my pleas only seemed to annoy him, and he ordered Crawford to administer 20 lashes as punishment for my presumption in questioning his business decisions. The beating took place in front of the assembled enslaved population, a public demonstration of the consequences of challenging the master's authority. As Crawford's whip cut into my back, as I tasted blood and dirt and felt my flesh being torn open, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I would not watch my sister disappear into the hell of Louisiana sugar plantations. I would not spend the rest of my life wondering what had become of her, imagining the cruelties she might be enduring, knowing that I had done nothing to prevent her destruction. Even if it cost me my life, I would find a way to take her with me to freedom, or I would die in the attempt. The escape was planned for a Saturday night in August, when the master's family was visiting relatives in Norfolk and the plantation's security was reduced to Crawford and a single assistant overseer. I had been preparing for months, stealing tools from my father's blacksmith shop, accumulating food that would not spoil quickly, and studying maps and newspaper accounts that might help me understand the geography of freedom. I had also been gathering information about the Great Dismal Swamp, the vast wilderness that lay between Virginia and North Carolina, and was rumored to shelter communities of escaped slaves who had learned to survive in its dangerous depths. The swamp was treacherous, filled with quicksand, poisonous snakes, and disease-carrying insects, but it also offered something that no other place could provide: sanctuary beyond the reach of masters and slave catchers. Mary and I slipped away from the quarters just after midnight, carrying our meager supplies and following paths that I had scouted during previous hunting trips with my father. The plan was to reach the Great Dismal Swamp before dawn, where we could hide among the cypresses and marshes until we could make contact with the underground railroad network that was rumored to operate in the area. The journey to the swamp took us through 20 miles of farmland and forest, traveling by moonlight along paths that would leave minimal traces for tracking dogs to follow. I had studied the techniques used by successful escapees, learning to wade through streams to break our scent trail, to avoid roads where patrols might be watching, to move quietly through the darkness without creating disturbances that might alert anyone to our passage. The Great Dismal Swamp was a vast wilderness that stretched across the border between Virginia and North Carolina, covering more than 1,000 square miles of forests, marshes, and waterways that provided sanctuary for runaway slaves, escaped criminals, and anyone else who needed to disappear from civilized society. The swamp had been formed over thousands of years by geological processes that created a unique ecosystem of standing water, cypress trees, and dense vegetation that made travel difficult and tracking nearly impossible. But the swamp was also dangerous in ways that went beyond the threat of human pursuit. It was home to poisonous snakes, alligators, disease-carrying insects, and areas of quicksand that could swallow a person without a trace. The water was often contaminated with bacteria that could cause deadly illnesses, and the dense vegetation could hide dangers until it was too late to avoid them. Despite these hazards, the swamp had attracted communities of escaped slaves who had learned to survive in its hostile environment and had created their own societies based on freedom and mutual cooperation. These communities were rumored to include hundreds of people who had successfully escaped from slavery and were living as free individuals in hidden settlements scattered throughout the wilderness. We reached the edge of the swamp just as the sun was rising, exhausted from a night of careful travel through forests and fields, but exhilarated by the knowledge that we had successfully escaped from the plantation without being detected. The morning air was thick with moisture and the sounds of wildlife awakening to another day, and for the first time in my life, I felt something that might have been hope. But our freedom was short-lived. Within hours of reaching the swamp, we heard the sound that every runaway slave dreaded, the distant baying of bloodhounds following our scent trail. Crawford had discovered our absence much sooner than expected, and he had immediately sent word to Norfolk, requesting the services of the most skilled slave catcher available. Silas Garrow had arrived at the plantation with his pack of hounds before noon, examined the trail we had left, and begun pursuit with the confidence of a man who had never failed to recapture human property. His dogs were specially trained for tracking in difficult terrain, and his own skills as a hunter were legendary throughout the region. The pack consisted of 6 bloodhounds, each weighing over 100 pounds and trained specifically for tracking human scent over long distances and through various types of terrain. Garrow had bred these dogs himself, selecting for stamina, intelligence, and the ability to maintain focus on a particular scent trail even when distracted by other odors. The dogs were not trained to attack, but rather to track and corner their quarry until Garrow could arrive to make the capture. The chase that followed would last for 6 days, a deadly game of pursuit and evasion played out in the treacherous terrain of the swamp, where one wrong step could mean death from natural causes, even if we managed to avoid capture. Garrow pursued us with relentless determination, never seeming to tire, never losing our trail for more than a few hours, always appearing when we thought we had finally outdistanced him. On the first day, we tried to confuse the dogs by wading through streams and marshes, hoping that the water would wash away our scent and force Garrow to waste time searching for where we had emerged. But his hounds were too well trained, and his own knowledge of tracking too extensive, for such simple tactics to work for long. The bloodhounds could follow a scent trail even after it had been diluted by water, and Garrow knew exactly where to look for signs of our emergence from streams and marshes. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with similar attempts at evasion hundreds of times before, anticipating our moves and cutting off our options with methodical precision. On the second day, we attempted to throw them off by doubling back on our own trail, creating false paths that might lead the pursuit in the wrong direction. We spent hours carefully retracing our steps, then branching off in unexpected directions, hoping to create enough confusion to buy time for escape. But Garrow seemed to anticipate every move we made, cutting through our deceptions with the ease of someone who had dealt with similar attempts many times before. His understanding of human psychology was as important as his tracking skills, allowing him to predict the decisions that desperate people might make when faced with capture or death. By the third day, it became clear that we could not simply outrun or outmaneuver our pursuer. Mary was exhausted from the constant travel and poor sleeping conditions, and I was beginning to understand that Garrow would never give up the chase as long as we remained together. The reward for our capture was substantial, and his reputation depended on bringing us back alive. The swamp was taking its toll on all of us, but Mary was suffering more than I was from the constant exposure to moisture, insects, and contaminated water. She had developed a fever that was growing worse each day, and her strength was failing in ways that made continued flight increasingly difficult. That evening, as we huddled in a cypress grove trying to rest while listening for sounds of approaching pursuit, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I told Mary that we needed to separate, that she should continue deeper into the swamp, while I led Garrow away from her trail. "I won't leave you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she understood what I was proposing. "We started this together, and we'll finish it together." "You'll finish it alive," I replied, holding her close while my own heart broke at the thought of losing her. "That's all that matters. Find the Underground Railroad, get to the north, live free. That's worth more than both of us dying in this swamp." The separation was accomplished by a technique I had learned from reading accounts of successful escapes. We waded together through a large marsh. Then I lifted Mary and carried her to dry ground on the far side, leaving only my footprints in the mud. I then returned through the water to the opposite shore, creating a trail that would lead Garrow away from where Mary had actually gone. We separated before dawn on the fourth day, with Mary heading northwest toward areas where we had heard that communities of escaped slaves might be found, while I turned south and east, making no effort to hide my trail as I led Garrow away from my sister's path to safety. The decision to sacrifice myself for Mary's freedom was both the hardest and the easiest choice I had ever made. Hard because I was abandoning any hope of my own survival. Easy because her life was worth more to me than my own. If one of us could escape, it should be her, and if my death could purchase her freedom, it was a bargain I was willing to make. The next 2 days were a desperate race through increasingly treacherous terrain, with Garrow and his dogs never more than a few hours behind me. I was beginning to suffer from exhaustion and dehydration, and I knew that capture was becoming inevitable unless I could find some way to change the nature of our deadly game. I was moving through sections of the swamp that I had never seen before, areas where the water was deeper, the vegetation denser, and the dangers more immediate. But I was also moving toward areas where the terrain favored someone on foot over someone trying to manage a pack of dogs, where knowledge of the local environment could provide advantages that might offset Garrow's superior resources. On the 6th day of pursuit, as I struggled through a particularly dense section of swamp, where fallen trees and tangled vines made travel almost impossible, I heard Garrow's voice calling through the forest with the confident tone of a man who knew his prey was finally trapped. "Josiah," he shouted, his voice echoing off the water and trees. "I know you can hear me, boy. You've led me a good chase, better than most, but it's over now. Come out with your hands up, and I'll make sure you get back to your master in one piece. Keep running, and I'll let the dogs tear you apart when they catch you." The threat was probably empty, since Garrow's reputation depended on returning valuable property in good condition, but it revealed his growing frustration with a chase that had lasted longer than he had expected. Most runaway slaves were captured within 48 hours, and my ability to evade him for nearly a week was beginning to damage his professional pride. I had reached the end of my endurance, but I had also reached something else, the understanding that I would rather die as a free man fighting for my liberty than live as a slave who had submitted to recapture. If Garrow wanted to take me back to the plantation, he would have to kill me first. I climbed into the branches of a massive cypress tree, pulling myself high enough to survey the surrounding area and plan my final stand. From my elevated position, I could see Garrow approaching with 3 of his hounds, moving carefully through the swamp, but with the confidence of someone who believed that victory was assured. Garrow was even larger than I had expected, a giant of a man who moved through the difficult terrain with surprising grace and speed. He wore dark leather clothing that had been waterproofed against the swamp's moisture, and he carried an arsenal of weapons that marked him as someone prepared for any contingency. He carried a rifle across his back, 2 pistols on his belt, a long knife in a sheath on his thigh, and a coiled whip attached to his saddle. His horse was a powerful animal trained for difficult terrain, and his dogs moved with the disciplined efficiency of creatures that had been bred and trained for this specific purpose. But I had advantages that Garrow might not have anticipated. I knew this section of swamp from hunting trips with my father. I was desperate enough to take risks that a professional tracker might avoid, and I had tools and skills that most runaway slaves did not possess. Hidden in my pack was an axe that I had taken from my father's blacksmith shop, a tool that I had shaped and sharpened myself for cutting firewood, but which could serve as a weapon if circumstances required. The axe had a 3-pound head forged from the finest steel, mounted on a hickory handle that I had seasoned and shaped to fit my grip perfectly. I had also brought rope, a knife, steel and flint for making fire, and other equipment that could be used for more than their intended purposes. Most importantly, I had the knowledge that my father had given me about working with metal and wood, understanding the principles of leverage and force that could make a smaller man dangerous to a larger opponent. As Garrow and his dogs moved closer to my hiding place, I made my final preparations. I secured one end of my rope to a sturdy branch, tested its strength, and prepared to descend into the swamp for what I knew would be a fight to the death. The attack came as Garrow passed beneath my tree, his attention focused on the ground where his dogs were following my scent trail. I dropped from the branches like a falling stone, landing on his back with enough force to drive him forward into the shallow water and cause him to drop his rifle. The impact stunned us both, but I recovered first and managed to wrap the rope around his throat before he could draw one of his pistols. For several moments we struggled in the muddy water and tangled vegetation, both fighting for our lives, with the desperate strength of men who understood that only one of us would survive this encounter. Garrow was stronger than me, but I had the advantage of surprise and the motivation of someone fighting for his freedom rather than just his livelihood. I managed to maintain my grip on the rope while avoiding his attempts to reach his weapons, gradually tightening the noose around his neck as we rolled through the marsh water. But the dogs were also attacking, and I felt teeth tear into my leg as one of the hounds tried to protect its master. The pain was excruciating, but it also triggered a rage that gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I released the rope and grabbed my axe, swinging it with all the force I could muster. The first blow caught the attacking dog in the head, killing it instantly, and sending its body splashing into the dark water. The second blow was aimed at Garrow himself, who was struggling to draw his knife while gasping for air through his compressed windpipe. The axe blade caught Garrow in the side of his skull, just as he was drawing his knife, splitting his head open like a ripe melon and ending his career as a hunter of human beings in a spray of blood and brain matter. He collapsed into the dark water of the swamp, his body convulsing briefly before going still forever. The remaining dogs scattered when their master fell, apparently understanding that their purpose had died with him. I stood over Garrow's body for several minutes, watching his blood mix with the swamp water, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and horror at what I had done. I had killed a man, taken a human life with my own hands, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But I had also eliminated one of the most dangerous enemies that escaped slaves could face, removed a predator who had destroyed countless lives in pursuit of profit and reputation. I searched Garrow's body and equipment methodically, taking his weapons, his money, and the detailed notes he kept about his tracking